Okay, I tend to wander around a little bit, so they decided to wire me. Well, thank you, Harris, first of all, and thanks to the conference board for having me here. We're really happy to sponsor the conference and hope that a lot of good comes out of it. I love the notion of nuggets. I kind of always put these talks together with that in mind, that you probably will forget, if you're like me, you'll forget about 99% of what I've said within the next 2 hours. But if you take a couple of nuggets away, that's what I'm hoping for. So that's my goal. So thank you all for being here, and thank you all for looking so bright and shiny first thing in the morning on the first day of the conference. I think that makes you all high potentials. So, just in case your organization needs to know, you can have them call me. You have been designated high potential. That's what we're going to talk about. That's what I want to talk about today. And some of the priorities that came up before that Harris showed sort of touch on this, and it's certainly a big piece of the succession process. I'd like to see one more time, how many people here are in charge of the process and/or tools used for identifying and developing high potentials, using that in succession? Okay, so quite a few of you. You have my condolences. I have done that in a variety of organizations. It's a very difficult job. The reason I want to talk about it is I think it is incredibly, identifying and developing high potential leaders is an incredibly important task. And because when we do that, we're attempting to ask what I believe is the most fundamentally important question in human affairs, not just in corporate affairs, but human affairs, and that is, who shall rule? Right? That's what we're doing, is choosing, answering the question, who shall rule in the future? Now, you may have seen the title for this talk and thought, oh no, we have to endure another talk about high potential. It's not a new topic. I did a casual search the other day and found 30,000 articles on high potential. So it's not a new topic. And yet, if you type the sentence stem, "my boss is," into your favorite search engine, Google, Bing, whatever, you will get answers like this: lazy, a tyrant, crazy, my favorite, insane, bully, mean. You get the picture. So and that's based on phrases that actual humans have typed into those search engines before, right? And meaning that there are a lot of people out there, apparently, who think their boss is crazy, insane, mean, abusive, and a bully. That, to me, says there might be a problem with identifying high potentials or identifying leaders in general. Now, if you are not like me, I believe everything I read on the internet, but if you're not like me, then maybe, how about this? There are large studies, cross-national studies, that show that about 30 to 60%, depending on the study, of leaders act destructively, as seen by the people who are the targets of that destructiveness, that is, their teams and their organizations. One really large cross-national survey showed that 82% of respondents said they did not trust their boss. 82%. The 30% engaged, this was one of my favorite games every day. Gallup used to have a 7-day rolling engagement index. Have you seen this? It's gone now. They took it down. I think it was just too depressing. But they took it down about a year ago. But I used to watch it all the time. And they did it for years. And you can still find this online, but if you look at the results over the course of a number of years, it always hovered between 30 and 35%. That is, 30 to 35% of our people in our organizations are engaged. Only 1 out of 3. There's great research out there linking leadership to engagement. So that also tells me there's a leadership problem. Over 50% of employees have said they have quit a boss. You know, the old adage, we quit bosses, not organizations. It actually turns out to be true about 50% of the time. And the number is probably really a conservative estimate, and we've all seen these before about, you know, what is it, on average, what does it take to replace a senior manager? What's the cost for a failed leader? So there's lots of evidence. These, I think, much more credible than what you can find on the internet, but all based on really sort of sophisticated research, but all also pointing to a problem, a $550 billion productivity problem with leadership derailment and leadership destructiveness in the United States alone. So that's just the U.S. alone, and it's not a problem that is unique to us, as I'm sure our folks from outside the U.S. can attest. So there is a leadership crisis, but here's the interesting thing. There are some large studies showing that about 98% of organizations, large organizations, say they have some process in place to identify and develop high potential leaders and to plug them into their succession planning process. On the other hand, only about 1 out of 3 of those organizations say they are well prepared. And I think we saw similar ratios when you asked the same question this morning. So what's wrong with this picture? We have 30,000 articles. We've studied this issue to death. We all have processes in place for it, and yet only 1 out of 3 is willing to say, yeah, we actually do it pretty well and we solve some of our problems with it. So that's the starting place for me here today. And I think there are maybe 4 key things that are wrong with this picture, and I want to talk about each of these in turn. One of those is, I think part of our problem is we just start with the wrong definition of leadership often. Well, let me ask you this. I'll take another poll. How many of your organizations have a very clearly stated definition of what is leadership? 2. I see 3, 4. Okay, 4 hands. 4 hands. So, okay, maybe we start with no definition of leadership, and that's the problem, but I'm going to assume we have some implicit definition, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I think it is one of the things that plagues us. It's one of the reasons that 1 out of 3 companies say they are not well prepared in this regard. So we're going to talk a little bit about definitions of leadership and see if we can provide some new ideas there, some nuggets. Secondly, if you start with the wrong definition of leadership, that will lead you to the wrong definition of high potential by default. If you start with no definition of leadership, that will lead you to an incorrect definition of potential by default. And when you do that, you will select the wrong hypos. That's the end game. I think part of the reason this is all true and part of the reason all of these problems persist, despite 30,000 articles and a lot of work on this topic, is that we don't have a comprehensive model to sort of pen our efforts to and to use as a touchstone for these processes. So I'm going to propose one for you. And hopefully that'll be a nugget you can take. So if we start with this issue of what is leadership, traditionally there are 2 ways leadership has been defined. If you look at the academic literature, the popular literature, the books out there on leadership, you'll kind of find two varieties of definitions. The first one I call positional perspective. That is, it's about who's in charge, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And the second one is a definition based on the nature of human nature. And we call that the evolutionary perspective. It tends to be the one we favor at Hogan and the one on which we base a lot of our research. So if we start with the question about what's the right definition, what's the most useful definition of leadership, the most common one is this. Now, maybe there are different labels for it, but the most common one is this. A leader is someone who is in a leadership position. right? So it's really about the position. It's not about the person at all. It's about the position. If you get promoted into a leadership position, you are a leader. That's what this definition leads to. It also is a privilege then to be bestowed on someone as opposed to a set of characteristics or a set of abilities that a person brings to the organization. So it's a really different kind of lens to look at. This is actually either explicitly or implicitly the definition of leadership that is used in much of the academic study of leadership. That is, they go find samples of leaders, quote, leaders, people who are in leadership roles in organizations, and then study them and see what happens. It is also, largely speaking, the definition, usually implicit, that is used in the popular press about leadership. There are, I looked the other day, about 8,000 books on leadership that you can find on Amazon. Many of them are books that idolize people who have achieved high-level leadership roles in various companies. Many of those books idolizing those leaders are actually autobiographies. So, and they start with this definition. I achieved this high-level leadership role, therefore I must be a great leader, and therefore I must have something significant to teach others about how to be a great leader. So that's positional leadership in organizations. Practically speaking, how do you find it? How do you identify it? Well, senior leaders know it when they see it. How many of you are in consulting? Do consulting? Quite a few. So the word that used to make me tremble the most when I was doing selection, particularly working with a board to try to do CEO selection, was when they would say, somebody with presence. Right? And what the hell is that? What is presence? Well, we know it when we see it. We know it when we see it. So if you start with this definition of a leader is someone who is in a leadership role, that leads to how do you find high potentials? Well, you know it when you see it, right? You know it when they see it. Whoever shows up seeming like they might be a leader, I see people are laughing. I know you've experienced this. If you show up looking like a leader, seeming like a leader, you must be a leader. Walks like a duck. So, if you start with that definition of leadership and you follow it through to what is leadership potential, that will lead you to choose to identify high potentials who are highly socially skilled, who are really good networkers, who are very attention-seeking and willing to tell you what's great about them. In short, these are really politically skilled people. And I'm not deriding political skill or interpersonal skill. It's important in organizations, clearly, and we'll come back to that point. But using it as the sole basis for choosing who's high potential leader or who might be an effective leader is problematic at best. And we call that leader emergence. So I'm going to come back to that theme a little bit later. But we call that leader emergence. That is, who shows up and seems like a leader, or who shows up on the high potential list because the boss knew them and liked them, and they were connected. Okay, so that's leadership emergence. That's starting with the what's a leader? A leader is somebody who's in a leadership role. We take an evolutionary perspective, so I have to have a big, brute on the screen. We start with what's the nature of human nature, and in order to think about that, that may seem really esoteric, and I'll try to make it a little more concrete, and why I think it's really important. So we start with what do we know from research about humans? One of the things we know is humans always have been, are today, and always will be group living. It's a fundamental truth about humans. We are group living. It's not only about humans, but it is true about humans. We're always group living. A second truth about humans is warfare has been constant since known history. And it is a constant today, and it will be a constant tomorrow. There's a really interesting letter that Albert Einstein wrote to Sigmund Freud one time. And this is really true. He wrote Freud a letter saying, there are lots of problems in the universe I'm beginning to understand. And I believe I have a handle on how to research them and continue to shed light on them. But one fundamental problem, the answer to one fundamental problem really escapes me. And that is, why is there war? So that was the question to Freud. Why is there war? And Freud's response was essentially, because we can't help it. We're hardwired to compete. And that's why I say this is an evolutionarily based perspective. There is a fundamental truth about humans, and that is we are hardwired to compete. And there's some great things about that. But we are hardwired to compete. So between groups, there is always competition. There is always warfare, but in the organizational sense, there is always competition. Within groups, okay, if between groups there is always a competition, what that means is you need a group in order to survive. And what do you need to have a group? You need to have people who are banded together, who are connected, who are collaborative, who are willing to get along with each other. Within groups, you also have a constant competition to answer the question, who shall rule, right? People are jockeying for position. And just as in primitive groups, when the one who jockeyed for the highest level position got better and more food, better and more shelter, better and more mates, current people who make it to the top of corporate organizations get better resources, better pay, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always competition within groups for these high-level roles. So these are just sort of some fundamental truths about human nature. So what does that have to say about leaders? If it's true that that humans always live in groups, that there's always competition between groups, and there's always two competing needs within groups, that is, who shall rule, and we have to get along in order to survive. If all of that is true, and we believe it is, and there's a lot of evidence to show that it is, if all that's true, then what does that tell us about leaders? What does it tell us about how to define leadership? Well, we think it says the leader's job is to balance all of this getting along and getting ahead, all of these hardwired motivations that we have. That is, to the degree a leader is able to provide the balance within a group or an organization at large between people's selfish needs and their collective needs, their collaborative needs, to the degree the leader is able to balance those, that's an effective leader. So that leads to a definition of leadership. That is, leadership is about group success. So if you start with leadership is who's in the position, that leads you to a conclusion that leadership is about the individual. We think leadership is about the group. That is, the definition of an effective leader is a person who is able to enable an effective group. So how do you measure leadership? Through group outcomes. Historically, human groups, primitive human groups who did not have a leader who could balance those competing motivations or competing tendencies became dinner. And that's what this human rib bone is about. It has teeth marks on it. So if you failed at leadership, if you failed to choose the right high potentials, you became dinner. The good news today is, if you're not doing a great job in your organization, you're probably not going to become dinner. I can't guarantee it, but you're probably not. The bad news is, if you're not doing an effective job at defining and selecting high potential leaders, your organization may fail. or at least may be suboptimal. Okay, so if you take that definition of leadership, that is, leadership is about helping the group achieve its outcomes or helping the organization achieve its outcomes. It's not about the role, it's about the group. That leads you to a definition of high potential, which is a leader is a resource for the team. If you look at research on what contributes to followership, you find about 4 key things. One of those is the view from below is we want someone who is high integrity, someone we can trust. And this is from the research, not ours, but it's academic, it's published. We want somebody who's high integrity, somebody we can trust. We want somebody with decent judgment, somebody who doesn't make decisions that will cause us to fail, but in fact makes decisions that will help us to succeed. We want somebody who has some kind of competence, that is technical competence or industry competence, experience, and so forth. Somebody who knows something about what it is we're trying to do here. So not a professional MBA who's sort of industry agnostic, but somebody who actually knows how to make what we make. And then finally, vision. Somebody who can plot a course that will help us put aside those selfish motives we have and work collectively toward an end goal. So those are key things that if you look from the view from the lead, those are key things that they want to see in a leader. Those are things that will in fact help that leader put a group together and focus that group in a particular direction. We call that leadership effectiveness. That is, leadership effectiveness is about creating an effective group. Leadership emergence is about getting into a leadership role. Leadership effectiveness about creating an effective group. There's a lot of great research out there, actually, about this phenomenon, too, of emergence versus effectiveness. And just one example that I wanted to talk about a little bit, there's a researcher named Fred Luthans. Does anybody know who Fred Luthans is? He's an academic. He wrote a great book called Real Managers almost 30 years ago. That we've ignored and forgotten ever since. But it's a really intriguing book. And what he did with his team, he followed 437 managers around for a year with his team. They collected all kinds of ratings, they did assessments, they did behavioral observations. They literally followed these leaders around for 1 year. And so at the end of the year, they had this mass of data. And the notion was, we want to see what leadership's all about. They sort of went in with no hypotheses about that and wanted to see what they found on the back end. Well, what he described was 2 groups, 2 distinct groups in this group of 437 managers. One of them he described as these are people who spent their days, by and large, networking around the organization, talking to their boss, volunteering for new opportunities, telling people what they had accomplished in the days, weeks, and months before. So they were highly politically skilled, highly connected, and actually really well known across the organization. He called those emergent leaders. They're the people who kind of showed up. On the other hand, he said, there's a smaller and much less well-known group here who spent their days, by and large, working with their teams, managing down, providing guidance, helping their team get the resources it needed, and so forth. But they were sort of low visibility in the organization because they were actually engaged with their teams day to day as opposed to engaged at the higher levels. He called those effective leaders. The really interesting thing about this, or one of the really interesting things about this study, is that he also found that there's only about a 10% overlap between those 2 groups. So, how many of you are using some form of manager nominations to choose high potentials? A number. If you do that, we believe you are over-indexing on those emergent leaders. I'm seeing people shake their heads and smile. Those are the people who show up. Those are the people who the boss knows. Those are the people who the boss likes. That is, if you're using supervisory nominations, you are probably over-indexing on emergent leadership. And why is that a problem? Well, what Luthans showed us is you may be only getting about a 10% effectiveness rate. That's a problem. It's very interesting. I mean, you could look at this two ways, too. And you could think, well, on the one hand, it's good to be networked and politically skilled and so forth. So maybe what those people need is development about what does it take to actually run an effective team. And that's a fair statement. And on the other hand, you may have sort of, the nerds in the back room who are really effective at working with their teams, but no one ever knows them, so they don't get the opportunity to lead. So maybe those folks need development on how to network, how to build relationships and so forth. So it can go both ways. But in most of our process, we're over-indexing on leader nominations as the primary tool or the final word. Even a lot of times in organizations, when they use assessments or 360s or structured interviews or whatever as part of the identification process, when it really comes down to building the list, the leaders have veto power. And that's all about emergence. So the problem with that, of course, being rewarding to deal with and highly politically skilled and so forth, says little to nothing about real leadership potential. Politically based processes identify politicians. Politicians may be leaders and may not be. And I could give you an example, but it's far too easy. So, I had to touch on it in some way. I mean, right? I mean, okay. So, all right. So we set out a couple of years ago at Hogan, sort of, after a lot of thinking about this and a lot of talking to lots of our clients about these problems. We set out a few years ago to really do some research. Those of you who know something about Hogan, we're basically a bunch of nerds. We are really research focused. We do nothing without doing research. We have a big research team, really fantastic people on it, really great technical minds. But we set out to do a research study on high potential. To see if we could come up with a model and an approach that might be broader, more effective, might help organizations choose effective leaders, not just emergent leaders. And this is just a list of goals. We put a team together. We actually worked together for 18 months, some consultants, some researchers, and we set out 5 goals. One is we decided we were going to start with what is leadership. A leader is someone who can build and sustain an effective group. So starting with this evolutionary definition. Secondly, we wanted to come up with a model, not necessarily an assessment. We're an assessment firm, but we really wanted to come up with a model that could be applicable across organizations and across industries, that would not be limited. And I will also, make the caveat here that we weren't crazy enough to believe that we were going to come up with the holy grail of high potential identification. There are many others out there on the market. If that's what you're looking for, many others out there on the market who will tell you they've already found it. We assumed it was not possible. We still believe it's not possible. But we did want it to be applicable across a large range of organizations and industries. It had to be measurable. We are an assessment company. It's measurement. That's what we do. So we had to be able to translate the model into some measurable resource. I'm not going to talk about, I'm not here to pimp assessments today. That's not what I'm going to talk about. I really am going to talk about the model. It had to be supported by leadership research, so there's some really good leadership research out there. We didn't want to create something that was at odds. In fact, we wanted to create something that leveraged all the great research that's already out there. And we wanted to create a model that was useful for both identification and development, which are two halves of the same whole, really, when you're dealing with this problem. So the next question was what to measure in all of that. Well, after looking at all of the research and looking at we have a job analysis archive with about 20,000 studies in it. We have about 400 criterion-related validity studies. We've got about 7 million cases of data. So we had a lot of research in our archives to start with. After looking through all of that, all the academic literature, and so forth, talking to lots of clients, we decided on 3 things in terms of what we thought the model needed to measure. The first of these may surprise you, given the last 10 minutes here, and that is we decided to measure emergence. That is, most high potential identification and development, particularly the identification side, processes and organizations are among, if not the most, politically charged process any organization works on, particularly with regard to leaders. So it is important that you stand out to get an opportunity. We already know that. That's how most organizations choose their high potential leaders today. So you must stand out. Organizations are political. We didn't presume that we would be able to wipe the politics out of the process, so we decided to co-opt it instead. So that's number one. Second, of course, standing out's not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And necessary to get the opportunity, but not sufficient to be an effective leader. So we wanted to focus on effectiveness and focus on some elements that were related to being able to create and sustain an effective team over time. And then finally, we recognize, and this is where our derailer research really came in handy and was quite useful. We also understand that some people will derail anyway. That is, some people will be politically skilled and some people will have some of these characteristics related to creating and sustaining an effective group over time, and they will still fail, even despite those, because derailers are real. And there are some fundamental things that make us employable in a sustainable way over the long haul. And we also had done, I think the prior year, had done some research on just employability. What is it that takes, that makes someone employable over the long haul? It's true for leaders, it's true for entry-level employees. So those are the 3 elements of the model that we decided to measure after looking at all the research. So 3 broad domains or dimensions in the model here that I'm going to walk you through. One of those we called leadership foundations. Those are those basic employability things. One that's about leader emergence, which is about are you getting noticed? Does someone in the organization know that you have aspirations for leadership roles, for example, et cetera. And then leadership effectiveness, those characteristics or those abilities that actually lead to sustaining a high-performing team. So you have to start with the foundations, just like this building. If you don't have a firm foundation, everything else is going to crumble. So starting with that notion, we focused on 3 things here. One is being rewarding to deal with. That is, can people stand to be around you at work? It's sort of it's a very low bar, but in order for others to work with you as a leader, they have to at least be able to tolerate you to some extent. Secondly, you have to be able to think broadly, strategically about problems. I'll talk a little more about this. And then you have to be interested in somebody else's agenda, not just your own. So we started with the foundations. This model is made up of competencies, as you can see. So if we start with foundations, we started with getting along. That is, can you just simply work effectively with other people? Do they find you pleasant and rewarding to deal with? Otherwise, they'll avoid you, and that's a problem if you're a leader. Secondly, thinking broadly. This is about being able to solve problems that matter. Are you, A, able to identify those problems that matter, and B, able to provide some kind of solutions that are useful to the organization? And then finally, what we call following process, but it's really about, are you willing to and able to understand the organization's norms, processes, policies, rules? Are you able to understand them, and are you willing to follow them? And some people simply aren't, and that's a problem for employment in general, but it is certainly a problem for a leader who's trying to get other people to follow those processes and rules. So those are foundations. Leadership emergence, there will be nothing surprising here for you. I think we started with standing out, which is about are you willing to sort of toot your own horn and let others know about your accomplishments and your desires, your aspirations. Second is about building connections. This is something Lutherans found in that group, that is, people who are networked, who are coalition builders, who are sort of politically skilled and able to connect with a lot of different people. And then finally, not only are they able to make those connections, but are they able to leverage those connections to get things done? Has anyone here read this book called Hillbilly Elegy? Do you know this book? One of the things, it's a really interesting story about a guy who came from just abject poverty and eventually went to Yale Law School, and is a really successful guy, and it's sort of his reflection on how he got there and what the barriers are for a lot of people who started in the circumstances. And this is a distinction he makes, which I think is really clever on his part, which is he learned at one point you have to have connections in order to sort of get to a different level. What he didn't learn at time one was you also have to know how to leverage those connections. So it's not enough to just make the connections, you have to leverage. But that's also what we found, coincidentally. It's before I read the book, so I didn't steal it from him. But that's the point of those last two here. You have to be able to build connections, but you also have to be able to use them to get something done, influence people. And then finally, leadership effectiveness. So probably no surprises here either, but the first one is about motivating people to put aside those selfish urges and work toward the collective good, work toward the organizational goal, right? That's really what that's about. Second, we call it leading the business. This is about, being able to detect, focus others on critical business outcomes, and B, actually achieve those. Because that's really, for us, that's the measure of an effective leader, is somebody who actually gets the results. Doesn't just look like they're getting the results, actually gets the results through the team. So if the team's getting the results, that's an effective leader. And then finally, managing resources. So this is about part of the leader role in getting the human, financial, material resources that the team needs in order to be effective. So again, it's all about the team. It's not about the individual. It's all about the team. But it is about equipping them with what they need to be effective or to be successful over long haul. So that's the model. I see a lot of you taking notes. I know the slides are available, the model's available. And I really wanted to just share the model with you because I think, again, we are an assessment firm. We assess the model. But that's not the point. The point is we do believe this is a broad model of high potential that you can use whether you use assessments or not. And so the nuggets I wanted to try to leave you with are just a few application ideas. And whether you ever use assessments or not, I think there may be something for you here. I hope there's something here for you. First of all, we believe the model can be used for high potential identification, obviously, but a couple of thoughts about that. There are those 3 broad domains and 9 underlying competencies. Well, again, we didn't set out to create the Holy Grail. We set out to create a broad model. In your organization, probably priorities are different from other organizations. So you can start with the model and prioritize those competencies in a way that might be more unique to your organization. Some of them may be relatively critical. Some of them may be relatively unimportant in your organization because organizations value different things. So I think that's one way you can think about applying the model as you think about your high potential identification, is just simply prioritizing. But if you prioritize within those 3 domains, it also will help you make sure that you are creating a broad definition of high potential. That might help you avoid the trap most of us have been in, which is manager nominations or emergent leaders. So I think it can be a nice way to help just think about your own process a little bit. It's also relatively simple, relatively straightforward leap then to take the model and build structured interviews around it that you could use as part of your identification process. You could even get your senior leaders to use those interviews, perhaps, in some organizations. Or you could create interview-based 360s that talent management, leadership folks could do in your organization. So I think there are a lot of sort of really practical things you can do with it. One of the most practical, I think, is and we've had a couple clients do this, is aligning manager, if you use a manager nomination form, is aligning that nomination form with the model. It's particularly powerful if you have some other source of data, like 360 data or structured interviews or assessment data, and manager nominations that are both built on the same frame. Then you can have a talent management discussion, calibration discussion, that's very meaningful because everyone's using the same language. So I think that's just another thing you can think about in terms of a takeaway nugget. Secondly, for individual development, given that the model has the various competencies, 9 competencies across 3 domains, it's relatively easy then to help an individual think about where are they strong, where are they weak. We obviously have ways to assess that, but again, you could do it through structured interviews, you could do it through interview-based 360s. There's a lot of ways you get the data that you might need in order to help an individual do that. If you're a company, and we've had a client do this too very successfully, if you're a company that has experiences that you use as development resources, one thought is align those experiences with the model. So you may literally have experiences that are just about exposure, for example, and some people will need that. So it's another way to think about the model, perhaps. And then if you're an organization that's fortunate enough to have some development suggestion databases or online training resources, to the degree you could map them to the model, it's a relatively straightforward step then to individually curate development content based on this notion. And again, the whole idea behind that is to make sure that it's sort of comprehensive, that you're not falling into the emergent trap primarily. Same's true for cohort and group development. I think lots of ways to use it. I was really tempted to put the words big data on the screen because I thought that would grab everyone's attention, but I decided against it. And I used aggregate data instead. But if you aggregate across high potential groups, and we've had clients who have done this over multiple years, you can compare year to year to see, are you selecting the same kinds of people over and over again? Are you getting better at it as you tweak your process? Those kinds of things. You can also use that aggregate data. If you think about high potential as not only an internal process of identifying people you already have with potential, but also think about that as a process to identify people externally who have further leadership potential. Then looking at your existing pool, the aggregate data there can also inform your decisions about who to hire externally or what kinds of skills and abilities to look for externally. Wouldn't it be interesting to take this model, foundations, emergence, effectiveness, and create peer learning groups? Someone who's strong on in each of those 3 areas. And it's just another idea, another nugget I hope you can take away. So I think there are lots of ways to try to think about how you might do development. The other thing too is based on that same notion, if you've got these 3 different domains, if you look at aggregate data, you may have subgroups. So you may have some people who are great at politicking and becoming known and networking in the organization. You may have some people who are really great and their teams love them and their teams routinely outperform other teams. You may need different development content for each of those subgroups. The model might help you identify who should be in one and who should be in the other. This is just a really simple way of thinking about that. and that is, let's just assume you divided those people into, these are high on the effective part, low on the effective part, high on the emergent part, low on the emergent part. So if you have, for example, a group of people who are low on the effectiveness competencies, but high on the emergent ones, you might want to focus development for those people on team leadership skills. If you have somebody who's low on emergent and high on effective, maybe the focus there is experiential learning that gets them out into the organization, solving problems they wouldn't normally interact with, those kinds of things. So just another idea about that. Same notion about putting this in the context of external hiring. Just think about what kinds of skills do we have a deficit in, and so what should we go out and look for more of or less of. And finally, I think you can use this sort of as an audit tool, because it is a broad model. That is, looking at your own definition of leadership. First of all, do you have one? Second of all, is it comprehensive enough? If you find that you are more focused on emergence than a broader high potential definition, you could use this model to create a more inclusive identification process. You might want to focus on effectiveness when you actually get down to the point of making succession decisions. This is another really interesting thing, Harris, that you asked this morning about what happens. So you put all this work into it, and then what happens? The roll opens, and nobody on the list is good enough, right? I've seen that many, many times. But there's one way to think about this, too. Let's be really broad and inclusive at identifying high potential and use a very broad, robust model for doing that. And when we get to the point of making actual succession decisions, then let's really focus on those effectiveness characteristics. By doing that, we're likely to have more of the effective leaders in the pool. That's the point behind that one. Certainly could help you look at your development resources and how they're deployed and think about, are we offering the breadth of things that we should? And then finally, I think one of the roles HR and talent management folks, myself included at various points, have tried to do with regard to high potential identification is to manage the politics out of the process. Is anyone else other than me guilty of trying to do that at some point? Right? Try to create a process that is so airtight that the politics and the manager, I like this guy and I don't like that guy, won't come into it. I think if you think about this from a definitional standpoint and from a model standpoint, the role this provides or could provide for HR and talent management folks is a role of what I call model management as opposed to a role of politics management. Because we have failed at the politics management role, and we always will. It's just the nature of the game. It's why we put emergence in the model. We can't throw out the politics, so we might as well include it, but not over-rely on it. And so I think it's a really, I hope as the next 2 days go on, you kind of think about that one, because there are a lot of other terrific people here to provide some great insights, and maybe that can be something that's underlying the thinking that you take away. So, a few nuggets, a few final conclusions here. One is, evidence clearly shows, whether you're like me and believe everything you read on the internet or not, evidence clearly shows we're not selecting the right hypos. Secondly, evidence also shows, and we've done this research ourselves, but it's very easy to find out there, evidence also shows that we overemphasize emergence. And we always do that when we use a performance potential 9 block. I didn't get into that, but we do. We always overemphasize emergence. We always overemphasize emergence when we use manager nominations to select high potentials. So currently we are collectively over-indexing on emergence. Third, a more comprehensive and theory and research-based model exists to think about this. And that we've just gone through that covers the waterfront. foundational abilities, emergent abilities, effectiveness abilities. The model's measurable in a lot of ways, easily applicable. I hope you can think about your own process and sort of superimpose the model over it. And it doesn't require trying to manage the politics out of what is inherently, in most organizations, a political exercise. So, with that, I hope you have got your nuggets because I'm out. And thank you very much for your attention and for having me. Questions? Harris said he'll answer any question you have. So, yeah, I'm happy to attempt it if somebody has questions. Yes.
What's your alternative to the 9 box that's so emergent?
Well, let me explain why I said what I said first. And I'm not. I hate to criticize things without having an alternative. I'm not sure I have a great alternative. The reason I said you're over-indexing on emergence if you're using a 9-block is, in this, I may be overgeneralizing, but in general, you have performance and potential. Who makes both of those ratings? The boss. What's the difference between those two ratings? Nothing. There's great research. You do the performance management conference. There's great research out there about performance management, and I could probably stir up a real tornado in here momentarily about that. But there's really great research out there that shows performance management largely tracks along a path of who the boss likes. Potential nominations largely track along the same path. So what are you going to get? You're going to get, a process that looks relatively rigorous, but still over-indexes and doubles down on over-indexing on emergence. So what would I do to replace that? What I would propose is something along the lines of multiple data sources using a common underlying model, common underlying framework. Because, it is what we're trying to do is hedge our bets for the future. That's really what we're trying to do, is make some predictions that are really, really difficult predictions to make. No academician has come up with the right statistics to do this yet, to say this person is actually going to be ready in 5 years or 3 years. That's just nonsense. We just can't do it. So what we have to try to do is hedge our bets. And I think the way to do that is have a common framework, a common definition that drives that framework, and measure that framework in as many possible ways as we can. And then put all those data on the table and say, okay, there's a group of people who are high across the board. Great, you're in. You're high potential, as best we can tell. There's a group of people who are really low across the board, maybe next year. And then there's going to be some mixture, and that's where, okay, the type of the organization, the politics of the organization, the values of the organizations really come into play, and there has to be some kind of calibration discussion, which I think a lot of organizations have too. Is that helpful? Did I evade the question enough? Okay. Other questions? Yeah, please.
So when you talked about utilizing the 360 model for the assessment process,
Mm-hmm.
would you roll that, how did you do that if you didn't narrow down the pool first? If you're not using managers as the first cut of nomination, then are you doing 360s for the whole company? How do you narrow down that pool?
It's a really great question. And I think there are actually a number of ways you could do that. One that a lot of organizations have available is engagement data. Start with if you can cut that by manager, for example, start with managers who have the highest engagement data from their teams. So if you have to make a first cut at thinking about leaders who are actually effective, that's a pretty good bet. And there's good research linking those two, that is effective leadership and engagement. So that's one, I think, probably the best way that I could come up with for doing that. But you're right, it is a challenging task at best, right? Other questions? That's time. I'm getting the hook. So that's it. I will be around. Luckily, I'll be around to see a terrific program lined up for the next couple of days. So I'll be around and happy to chat about this or other things along the way. So we'll talk.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.